In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's how the Bible begins. In Hebrew, it's Bereshit v'ra Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Already in the Bible's very first word, Bereshit, there's a translation controversy. Do you translate it in the beginning or when God began? There's a tough grammatical issue there, and maybe we'll come back to it. Here's what really strikes me though when I consider the Bible's opening story. It just kind of throws us into the story without any introduction to God. There's no backstory on God. It's not like, okay, before we begin, let me tell you about this God, this character called in Hebrew Elohim, God. Elohim in Hebrew, by the way, is just a generic word for God, although it's a bizarre word in a way because in Hebrew it's actually plural. So it's like, but it's clearly referring grammatically to one being, God. Who is this God? We don't really get told by a narrator apart from what God does. God in the biblical vision is identified by his actions, and particularly in the opening creation story in the book of Genesis. I want to talk with a lot of specificity about the creation story in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. But before doing so, I want to acknowledge a slightly bigger context in which these stories are embedded, namely Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are sometimes called the primal history or the primeval history, which is just a fancy way of saying these are stories about the world and humanity in a very old, bygone age. And I have a confession to make, which is that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are some of my favorite chapters in the Bible. I could just read them over and over and over and over again. And in some ways, they're maybe the most familiar parts of the Bible, just because they're at the beginning. And if you're going to try to read through the Bible, you're definitely going to get through those chapters. And they're just super fascinating. I mean, just by way of overview, we have not only the creation of the world in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, but then in Genesis chapter 3, we have this bizarre, horrible, haunted story of a snake in this garden where the first people are. The people disobey God, and ruin and disaster and pain is introduced into the world. Then in Genesis chapter 4, one brother kills another brother. So you've got murder now entering the story. Genesis chapter 5, you have genealogies and some more kind of outworking of this. And then there's a giant flood in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, which destroys all of humanity that had just been created in this act of just enormous violence, which ends with a conciliatory note by God saying he would never flood the world again quite in that way. Then Genesis chapters 10 and 11 go into more genealogy and ends with a very famous story, the Tower of Babel, where humans in some mysterious way try to reach God or attain God's level, and God is having none of it, and he scatters them throughout the whole world. And we end in a place which is very different from where we began. We began with God speaking the world into existence and declaring the world good. But at the end of Genesis 11, it's not even clear that there's any future for God's relationship with people on any intimate kind of level. So these 11 chapters are the context in which the creation story is. And then, of course, the book of Genesis goes on after chapter 11. Because I want to focus on Genesis chapter 1 and 2, though, the creation story and the rest of the lecture, I want to say a few more things about some of these other stories that I know you're definitely probably interested in if you know anything about the Bible at all. Adam and Eve, the first two humans, put in the garden. This snake, where does the snake come from? Is the snake already there? Is the snake, it's a talking snake? Is that a normal thing that animals would talk? Eve and then Adam eat this fruit, both of them together as the snake talks to them, and their world falls apart. Maybe one of the most, maybe one of the most kind of like gripping features of Genesis 1 through 11 is the fact that the world is created good. And that's mentioned numerous and multiple times in Genesis chapter 1. But there's also this haunted, broken sense that although we live in a good world, something's deeply wrong with this place and even within ourselves. This sense that the world is simultaneously good, but also deeply broken, I don't know, I just feel like it describes me so well. It's almost like the Bible there is reading my mind. The Bible has set out a template for my exact life. Maybe you feel like that too. So I find Genesis 1 through 11, even though it has bizarre characters that are sometimes hard to understand, like who could understand Noah in this boat alone in this flood? He's not exactly an accessible character, you know, like as you read Genesis 1 through 11, you'll get a sense that this is a story and you can read it and you can really get into the characters and think about plot and characterization and description and emotion. But these characters are not always easy to understand. I confess that for myself, certainly. But I do understand their psychological world. of being broken down and of failure, while also having some sense that there's love and goodness and reality, and that the material world is somehow actually good. I think these first 11 chapters of Genesis do not let us off the hook by saying, people in that event in Genesis chapter 3, they sinned, they did a horrible thing, they listened to the snake, they shouldn't have, that's all true, and therefore life totally sucks and everything is wrong and nothing will ever be right again. I don't think that that's the message, no matter how deeply you get into the idea that humans really messed up in Genesis 3. No matter how deeply you imagine the scene of the murder in Genesis chapter 4, no matter how horrible the flood was in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, or no matter how scattered people become in Genesis chapter 11 at the Tower of Babel, there's still a sense in these stories that God wants to keep interacting with people by giving Adam and Eve clothes and restoring them into relationship, by putting a mark on Cain and ensuring that no one kills him, by sending a rainbow and repopulating the earth after the flood, or even just allowing humans to exist at all after the Tower of Babel incident. This is the world Genesis 1 through 11 sets out. It's a world that's good, and it was good, and as a Christian, I assume spiritually it's still good, but it's a world that's also haunted, broken, haunted by the ghosts of our ancestors, and by the ghosts of our own selves and the actions that we commit and the things that we do that break our world. Okay, we're back at the desk. God's identity as a creator comes up really fast in the Bible, like on page 1 in the very first line. Indeed, in the most ancient and comprehensive statements of Christian faith that we have, the creeds, like the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. So we get the sense that one of the first proclamations you can make about God is that God is a creator. Now, the fact that the Bible's creation story comes on page 1, Genesis 1, the very first chapter of the Bible, could give you a misleading impression, I think, as a reader of the Bible about one thing. Namely, that creation in the biblical vision and in the Christian vision is only or primarily about the past. That it's about something that happened then and it's all over with. But I've got news for you. For Christians, the creation story is an ongoing story. It's a story that's not just about our past, but it's also about our future. And here's something very important that we have to know about creation stories. Creation stories don't just tell it like it was, they also tell it like it is. Creation stories legitimate and sustain a contemporary world. That's really important. Let me give you an example of how a creation story could legitimate and sustain and create a contemporary world. Okay, story time. You're an ancient person. You're living in the ancient world. They don't have TV. They don't even have lights or the internet. They don't have BuzzFeed quizzes about which Taylor Swift song you are. I'm Look What You Made Me Do, okay? That's just the song that I am. Look what you made me do. Okay, it's a little awkward when I had to answer the question about which lipstick color I would wear, but whatever. Let's just pretend I never said that. Okay, we'll move on. Let me give an example. Story time. You are an ancient person. You're sitting around a fire and you hear a creation story that goes something like this. When there was nothing at all, there were just two waters moving, a dark, stormy, chaotic saltwater mass, and then fresh water. And they were mingling and crushing up against each other, and gods were born. Many, many gods, many goddesses, roiling, teeming masses of gods and goddesses. And they became so noisy that, in fact, one of the principal goddesses, she became so angry, but she was like, I'll put up with it. These are my kids after all. But another god was like, these little kid gods and goddesses are so annoying, they're so loud, let's kill them. The goddess says, no, let's not kill them. But in secret, they go and there's a murder, and her husband is killed. This throws the goddess into an absolute frenzy, and she threatens to upend the entire cosmos. And the other gods are so worried, they finally find a champion hero god. We'll call him Hero God, okay? And he's gonna come and he's gonna fight the goddess. Male versus female, right? It's very competitive and it definitely has this gender element. And this male god, the hero god says, I will defeat her, but if I do, you have to make me king. And they're like, okay, that's a great idea. Do it. So he fights her and he absolutely kills her in a gruesome, bloody battle. He cuts open her stomach. He dismembers her. He uses her dead carcass, in fact, to create a world, a new cosmos, with one half of her body being the earth and another half being the sky. He takes one of her allies in the battle and takes him and kills him too, and then kneads up his blood and his bone like bread and creates out of it this disgusting little being. And they say, behold, this disgusting little dirty being I created. Let's call it human being. And let's make this disgusting loser do all work for us and become our slave. And the gods are like, yeah! And they're applauding. And this is the cosmos. Can you imagine a creation story like that? It sounds maybe very foreign to you. Maybe it sounds a little exciting around the edges. I don't know. I tell you that story, I didn't make that up, by the way. In its broad outlines, that's a creation story from the ancient Near Eastern world, particularly from ancient Babylonia, called the Enuma Elish, that probably at least some, if not a lot of ancient Israelites might have known about. It was a very popular style of creation story in the ancient world, the creation battle. Okay. Now, thinking about this creation story, we're going to have to think about what kind of world a story like this perpetuates, sustains, and creates, legitimates. First of all, a story like that legitimates a world which is polytheistic. There are many, many gods. We know that from the story, right? They were all there and they were very competitive. But this leads to point number 2. The mood is competition, right? It's a world in which power is the sole measure of who is right and who is wrong. It's very difficult in life. I don't know if you've noticed this. This is a thing for me. It's hard to know culturally and religiously and in so many ways politically. It's hard to know who's right and who's wrong sometimes. But hey, if it's just a matter of power, the world of the Enuma Elish can be a creation story that can guide you. It's just about who gets to kill whom. It's about who's more powerful. Okay. It's a world that's mythological and polytheistic in which nature, the earth itself, is fused with the body of a dead goddess in a way, right? Remember in that story, the goddess's body is the earth and it is the sky. And so there's an identity between creator and creation that's at the very least a little bit ambiguous. At most, it's like totally identified, but it's not just identified with any god or goddess. The body of the world is the body of a defeated dead goddess. And human beings, in case you caught that part about the humans, right? We're created in this story from the blood of a defeated god. It's a very ignoble kind of scene. Maybe one in which you as a person wouldn't want to participate, right? A story like that could legitimate and sustain a very particular kind of world. One in which you as an average person, let's say, are dominated by leaders and powers above you, and that's part of what the created order is, and you were made to do nothing but be a slave. You were made to work, and you were made to do pretty degrading work, and you really can't expect that much out of it. If you have a creation story like the Enuma Elish, and I'm not suggesting that it could only have one interpretation. Surely people in the ancient world had many interpretations of their creation stories, just like Christians today have many different interpretations of the book of Genesis and its creation story. But if you had the Enuma Elish as your creation story, you could imagine the kind of world that would be legitimated, sustained, perpetuated, the kind of political world, the very emotions that you would be allowed to feel under a story like that, about who it would make you to be and who God would be in relation to you within a world like that. Thus, we arrive at the first point I want to make about the Bible's creation story in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The biblical creation account in the book of Genesis was a revolutionary document in its time, and it's a revolutionary document today. It's a revolutionary document, and the dimensions of its revolutionary character are many. They are literary, they're spiritual, they're social, they're political, and they're economic. Consider the simplicity of Genesis chapter 1 compared to how a creation story could be. Imagine you're now that Israelite, that ancient Israelite, or maybe that ancient person sitting around the fire, and you hear a creation story which says that there's a God and there's some water and there's a darkness. These are all elements of Genesis chapter 1 in the opening verses. There's a darkness that covers the face of the deep. And you're like, ooh, okay, the story's moving kind of fast. Let's get to the skull cracking. And then God said, let there be light. In Hebrew, it's yehi or, just those two little words. Do you want to speak Hebrew with me? You can say it after me. Yehi or. Let there be light. And what happens? Vaihi or in Hebrew. And there was light. Notice that simplicity and the revelatory non-confrontation between the command, the decree, and the action. Let there be light, and there was light. Creation for the Bible's God is not a struggle. He simply declares it and it happens. The end. Here's another thing that's revolutionary about Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis 1, there's a repeated refrain, which you'll see right away if you read it. It's one of its most notable literary features. And God saw, after each thing that he creates, God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was very good. Okay? Genesis chapter 1 declares, from God's perspective, the fundamental goodness of the material world and the fundamental goodness of creation. Humans in this story, by the way, especially as we get into Genesis chapter 2, have meaningful work. Work is considered to be a dignified activity. In fact, work is God's own design in this creation story for people, not to put them down or to make them slaves to any particular order or any particular politics of domination, but rather work is something that presumably in this story is fulfilling for people. It involves creativity. Adam and Eve get into this garden and they start naming the animals. Really just Adam in the beginning is naming the animals. They have choices about how they can do their work. And those choices, by the time we even get into Genesis chapter 3, can even result in pain and in disorientation for people. But nevertheless, humans have meaningful work in a paradise, in a garden. This is not slavery. Right? We also have what we might call demythologization. That's a really long word, right? Demythologization, stripping mythological elements out of nature and out of the world and making us sort of what we might call a natural universe. The sun and the moon and the stars don't receive any prominent place in the Genesis creation story, even though those elements in the Bible's ancient Near Eastern context were all very prominent god and goddess figures. In the book of Genesis, in very fascinating ways, the narrator there simply says, and God created the greater light and the lesser light. He doesn't even call them by their Hebrew names, but just calls them a greater light and a lesser light, perhaps even to de-emphasize their nature in a certain way. And the stars are created almost as an afterthought, whereas in the Bible's ancient Near Eastern world, stars were a really important religious element for astrology, for understanding the future and who we are in that place. In the book of Genesis, those things are de-emphasized in a notable way, I would say. In the ancient Near Eastern world, moreover, where do you get to see the image of a god? How do you know what a god looks like? Well, a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultures, probably almost all of them, had statues, had anthropomorphic, human-like images of gods in temples, and you could go to those temples, or you could maybe have some smaller versions in your home, and you could see the image of the god. But this is an extraordinary thing about the book of Genesis. The image of God is bestowed upon human beings. And not just human beings in general, and not just men, and not just women, but in a very revolutionary verse in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, male and female are created in God's image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. It's almost like a little miniature poem within the creation story, so as to emphasize that exact point, that men and women are created in God's image. This is something that I think is unique in ancient creation stories as far as I know. Indeed, the emphasis the Bible places on average, normal, everyday people is actually something that's pretty extraordinary in its ancient context. You wouldn't know this unless you spent tons and tons of time reading all kinds of ancient Near Eastern epics and myths and stories. But I have, and if you'll take my word for it, for at least for now, until you can do your own research, in those stories, you find stories that are very god and goddess and gods centric, you know. And average everyday humans don't really have a place. Heroic humans, kings and great warriors, they have a place in those stories, but not average everyday people. As you move throughout the biblical narrative, you're going to see that the Bible actually bestows an extraordinary amount of dignity on average workaday human people. Sometimes people even that don't have names, but people who nonetheless are created like Adam and Eve were, the very first humans in the pattern, in God's image. The Bible's a revolutionary document in its own time and even for our time today. Okay, another argument I want to make about the creation story in the book of Genesis. Our picture today as contemporary people, our picture of the material world has changed from what ancient people assumed the material world looked like and was made of. But we're confronted with the same basic mysteries. We're on the hook for the same responsibilities. We don't lose any responsibilities for faith, regardless of how scientifically sophisticated we get. How has our picture of the physical world not changed from the time that Genesis was written and first heard? Well, rocks are still rocks, you know, physical matter is still physical matter, bodies are still bodies, And if you stepped on a Lego in the ancient world, it still hurt. You cried out in an ancient language, okay? Things like that are still true. But undeniably, there are some different things about the way that ancient people thought of the world. There are some things, though, about the way that ancient people thought of the physical universe that don't quite match the way that we would talk about it today. For example, it seems clear that many ancient people, especially in the ancient Near Eastern world, not to speak of the Greek world to the west, saw the earth as flat. They thought we lived on a flat earth, and maybe there was something that the book of Genesis calls a rakia, or a solid dome over the top of the earth, or something like that. Psalm 93:1 has it, in a very iconic way. I'm paraphrasing, but God has created the world, it shall not be moved. So the earth is static. I don't think ancient people really had a sense that we were flying around at 26,000 miles per hour around the sun or anything like that. Literally all science by that name and by scientific method was elaborated and discovered in the modern period, which I know for so many of us might raise a question like, why didn't God reveal science sooner? I mean, I don't know. You could think about this. You could talk about this with your family or in your church or anything. Like, what would a creation story look like that was written today with our scientific assumptions today? Would it be different? Would it be metaphorical in some way that Genesis was or wasn't, or how would that work? I can only say I don't know why science wasn't revealed to people sooner in God's plan for the universe. I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I do know that there are a lot of things that presumably God could have revealed to people sooner than God did. Like, why not tell us how to make safe, clean nuclear energy in Genesis chapter 1? Or why not get more explicit about the picture of gender? It was very beautiful in Genesis 1:26, this idea of male and female, but why not elaborate that a little bit? We have a lot of conflicts around gender and so many other things that maybe God could have cleared that up. I don't know. Why didn't God tell us that women should vote, or that, slavery should never be something that anyone should ever do? Instead, these are the kind of things that have taken time. They've taken progress, right? And so the picture we get in the Bible is complete for faith. I think all Christians would agree on that the Bible's picture for faith is complete. But I think most Christians agree about the idea that, in fact, as humans grow and progress through time, there are certain things that God still has to teach us. Okay? So we're still learning about our material universe. I know that for many of us, the key question here is like evolution and creation. What's true and how old is the earth? And that's not a question I can solve for you here today. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not going to tell you what to think about that. But I can tell you that science has not removed our need for faith. I think any good scientist would tell you that there's an enormous amount of mystery still left in the world, and a lot that we still have to discover about creation and about where we stand physically and scientifically within it all. Science doesn't have all the answers. There's a lot that we still have left to do. Third argument I want to make about the creation story in the book of Genesis. Creation and incarnation go together. Creation and incarnation go together. In the briefest terms, and this is a bit of a spoiler for later in our journey through the Bible and through the history of faith, but we have broached this topic already. God becomes material flesh, becomes human body in the person of Jesus Christ. This is one of the most foundational, amazing, revolutionary ideas that Christians have, that God becomes human in the person of Jesus. In the famous words of the book of John, the Gospel of John in the New Testament, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, the Logos, became flesh, sarx in Greek, which is like meaty, fleshy, bone, all that stuff. God became human. This is what the word incarnation means. In Latin, carnis, incarnis, becomes flesh. God becomes material. Here's one thing that this definitely does mean. God is invested in our material world. And not only that, the particular way God creates the world in the Bible and sustains it makes God close to the world in a positive sense. Consider the famous Bible verse. Sometimes people hold up signs at football games behind the goalpost. John 3:16. What's John 3:16? For God so loved the world. Ton kosmon in Greek. God loves the cosmos, according to Christian teaching. We see that already in Genesis chapter 1 with this repeated declaration that the world is good. But I want to elaborate on this more. Any view from a Christian perspective, I'm speaking explicitly as a Christian here, any view that makes cosmic reality God's enemy, that makes material reality something that God is finished with, he wants to leave it behind, this is anti-incarnational language.
It's thus an anti-Christian view. In fact, early Christians worked really hard to eradicate the idea that God was not connected to the material world. Sometimes this view that God hates the material world, that he's just like spirit and he doesn't want anything to do with physical reality, is referred to as Gnosticism, the view of Gnostics. And early Christians worked really hard, really faithfully to eradicate that view. God is on team world, okay?
Go play!
By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet!
Captain Planet, he's our hero.
For God so loved the world. God loves the cosmos. In fact, when Christians recite their beliefs in a creedal statement like the Apostles' Creed, we actually affirm that we believe in the resurrection of the body. This is getting a little deeper into Christian theology, but I'll just jump there for a second. The resurrection of the body? Why would our bodies be resurrected? We know our bodies die. We see that happen. But resurrected? Yeah, I mean, this is a bizarre and astounding thing about Christian thought and biblical belief. Our bodies are going with us. God has a plan for the material world. It's not just being eradicated and destroyed. It may be remade and recreated, but it's not being left behind. So affirming God as a creator in the biblical vision has implications. It has implications for our environment. It has implications for our bodies, our sexuality, our systems of justice, the way that we treat each other. It has implications for our effort to create beauty and art. Any artists out there? Any poets out there? It has implications for the way we create music, the way we design our spaces for architecture. It creeps into every area of our material reality. Creation and incarnation go together. You all still alive out there? Okay, we're doing this. Here's my fourth argument. Creation is about the now. Creation's about the now. It's about the right now. I want to give you a few maybe technical examples from the Bible that help demonstrate this idea that creation is not just about the past. We don't want to over-focus on the past. The past is important, history is important, the material and scientific thing is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. Creation's about the now. Take a story like in the book of Exodus. We'll get to the book of Exodus, but in Exodus chapter 12, we have the story of the Passover. These people God creates, they're going to get stuck in Egypt and they become slaves there. And God has an amazing thing to say to them. He says to them, this day in which you're going to escape slavery, this is the first day of the year for you. The year starts now. Which is really astounding to think about how our sense of time could just be stopped and recreated. Have you ever had anything like that in your life where it's like you could almost like see the creation of yourself at a very particular time? Like maybe it was when you turned a certain age or you had a very particular experience. It might not have even been a good experience, or it might have been. But it's like almost like your life's history starts in that moment. On biblical terms, that's creation. We see that kind of creation language, by the way, all over the Bible. In the book of Isaiah, for example, the book of Isaiah is a book much later in the Bible than Genesis, but if you want to do some side reading, Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 are just filled with this kind of language, where the prophet there, the speaker, uses creation language to talk about Israel in a really hard situation and about how God has not just created them in the far, far past, but about how God is recreating them right now. And that the people are going to have a new experience, just like they did in that Exodus story, where the day of their release became the first day of the year to them. That's creation. In the New Testament, in Romans chapter 8, creation themes here are tied into themes of waiting with patience for future glory. The whole creation, the author there says in the book of Romans in the New Testament, is groaning. It's in the pains of childbirth. Creation is like a process in that sense. It's a spiritual process that's not even done yet, but there are still things that God is waiting to do. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, also in the New Testament, famously says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. That's really astounding language. The idea that there's not just creation in the past, but there's new creation that can happen. In fact, this theme even gets so wild that in a psalm like Psalm 74, the Psalms are a later book in the Bible that we'll get to, Psalm 74 uses creation imagery that actually sounds a lot like that weird Babylonian story I told you earlier from the Enuma Elish, where creation is a battle. And the psalmist is in fact crying out to God to actually do that battle and to win that battle, as though it's a battle that God still needs to fight. Which is kind of strange because Genesis 1 presents creation as something that's very whole, very complete. And yet here in Psalm 74, the speaker in a time of great distress is crying out to God to actually become a warrior and rise up and do that creation story all over again. Creation is about the now. It's ongoing. There are still things left to be created. I could also get personal about this issue about creation being about the now. At the time I'm making this video here, I'm 40 years old. 40 is kind of like an age in the American psyche when you're like classically in the middle of your life. I went backpacking recently and I had this crazy experience. I went backpacking to celebrate my 40th birthday just by myself. And I was in this wild mountain wilderness. I was so far away. I was kind of scared, but it was kind of fun. I don't know if you've ever done anything like that. And I was about to go to bed and I was sitting outside my tent alone. And I looked up in the sky and the moon was so clear. But the moon was like a half moon, like a perfect half moon. And I was thinking about like my life being half over. And I just like burst out crying by myself in the woods. But I was also laughing. Like I was laughing and crying. I was like, can you imagine if somebody had like walked up on me in the woods at that moment and they see like this dude alone, like scream crying at the moon? That's totally what I was doing. I was just totally unhinged. And I think in that exact moment, the reason I felt those emotions so strongly and thinking about me being 40 and at the middle of my life is because, I don't know, for me in my journey, just as a male, as a man who's now, you know, I've got 2 kids and I've got a wife and I've been married for a long time and my daughter's going into middle school. It's like, I look at my life and sometimes I think, I've done all the major things I can do. I have a wonderful wife. I have these beautiful kids. I went to school and I did the most schooling I could possibly do at the most awesome place possible. And I have a house and I've kind of acquired these things. And there gets to be a point, for me at least spiritually, where I'm like, what's left? Like, what's next? Does God have anything for me? Do I have anything to contribute, or do I just have to like make, dumb BuzzFeed Taylor Swift jokes? Like, is that all I have now? What does God have for me? Hildegard of Bingen, who was a medieval mystical Christian author, put it this way in a short poem that she wrote about God as a creator. She wrote, "Your power, God, is like a wheel around the world, whose circling never began and never slides to an end." If this creation keeps going and never slides to an end, it means that there are still things left, even inside of me, to be created. I need this affirmation of God as a creator, as a contemporary reality in my life. I need it so bad at middle age. And wherever you are, you're at an age where you need it too. Because this is our journey as people, and this is the journey of humans in Genesis 1-11. We're created good, but there's this kind of sense of brokenness, this sense that something's just off, that something needs to be fixed. I end with this question, asking you, no matter who you are or what your faith journey is, what's being created in you now? What are you willing to risk in this world of risky creation faith? What are you willing to risk believing in? What are you willing to risk doing in order to see something new created in your life?
So that would be something in Slam. It's like dun 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 dun. There's a siren going on in the background.
Yeah. That story though about the camping thing, that really happened. That was really real. It was really true. I know I talk quickly.